topically. I normally don't preach topically, but we have been for the last, as I said, 4 or 5 weeks, speaking on Esther today. So Lord, thank you for these gifts. As always, God, we want to steward them with your kingdom in mind, so help us to be good stewards. Lord, thank you for First Baptist, such a giving church. So grateful. Pray your blessing would reside not just on every giver, but on every person here this morning. I also pray, God, that you would give us ears to hear. I mean, really, Lord, give us ears to hear what your Spirit would say to the church today. It's our desire to lift your name up, Jesus. We ask these things in your name. Amen. Esther chapter 4. I think I'll start at verse 9 instead of, I think I was going to start at verse 6. I think I'll start at verse 9. My hopes today are I want to speak, I want to go through Esther chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4 in a little more detail. Spend a bit of time in 4 and then summarize the rest of the book, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then look at some of the principles of courage in Esther's life. Esther chapter 4, verse 9. Hatshepsut, he was an attendant of Esther's. Hatshepsut went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all of the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend his gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I've been called to go and see the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back his answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. You and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but for that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. Esther is one of the only 2 biblical books named and titled after the woman who played a major role in them. Ruth is the first, Esther is the second. In 597 BC, Jews were taken captive into Babylon, where they would spend the next 70 years of their life. That's a long prison sentence. In the second of 3 deportations in 586 BC, Jerusalem, including the Holy Temple, were destroyed and burned to the ground. In 538, a new world power took center stage. Persia, under Cyrus the Great, defeats Babylon. Babylon is no longer the center of any military power. And as the new ruling power, now led by King Xerxes, in verse 1 of chapter 4, verse 1 of chapter 1, Persia set the Jews free to return to their homeland. Ultimately, Persia still retained authority over Israel, as they did 126 other regions. There were many Jews who made the 800-kilometer journey back to Jerusalem from Persia. But there were many who stayed. About 79,000 Jews stayed in Persia. Many remained in exile in one of the Persian cities, especially Susa. modern day Iran. Not sure I want to be in Iran today. Verse 2, chapter 1. Susa had been their family home for the last 70 years. They decided to stay, not make that 800K journey to the ruins of their homeland. Jerusalem was in ruins. Esther, an orphan girl cared for by her cousin Mordecai, both Jews, they also decided to remain in Persia, to remain in Susa. A summary of Esther's life kind of looks like this. Early on in chapter 1, verse 3, King Xerxes of Persia made a feast for all of his officials and all of his servants. He wanted to show off his glory and splendor, the riches of his kingdom, the kingdom that he conquered. It was quite a party. It lasted 6 months, 180 days. In verse 5, he made another feast for those who actually lived in the capital city of Susa. That party lasted 7 days. Again, Xerxes wanted to impress all of his subjects. What a great display of wealth that he had. Power and generosity. He wanted to display it. He had quite an ego. His wife, Queen Vashti, in verse 9. She made a feast for the women. It was actually held in the palace, this feast. On the last day of the feast, verse 10, Xerxes drank until drunk. He commanded his wife through the voices of others. He commanded her to appear before him and other officials simply wearing her crown. Yes, just her crown. Presenting her beauty in an immodest way without clothing. Queen Vashti had a conscience, however. In touch with her own dignity, in verse 2, she refused the king's orders. Xerxes, his anger raised. It burned within him, the text says, so he had his wife banished or removed, permanently removed from his palace forever. Between chapter 1 and chapter 2, there's 4 years of time that takes place. So 4 years later, in chapter 2, verse 1, when the king's anger subsided, how many know that 4 years is a long time to be angry? His attendants began to assemble a harem chosen from the most beautiful women of the land. These women would be presented to the king, and the most favored woman would be made queen. This is a Miss Persian Empire contest. The winner would replace Queen Vashti. Enter Hadassah, that's her Hebrew name. Esther, her Persian name, in verse 7 of chapter 2. It's here we're told that she was an orphan, that her parents had died, and that her cousin Mordecai cared for her. The text says that she was lovely in form and in features, literally in the Hebrew. She was extremely beautiful, and she had a lovely figure. History suggests there were about 400 women, including Esther, who were selected for the king's harem, for his beauty pageant. It appears that these women didn't really have a choice. It was an edict from the king, a command from the king, an order, in verse 8. So Esther, in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 2, she spends 12 months, get this, 12 months in beauty prep school. She becomes a model in beauty prep school. And during all of that time, we're told in verse 10 that on the advice of her uncle Mordecai, Esther did not utter a word, not one single word, about her Jewishness, about her heritage, about her Jewish family, about her Jewish roots. She was to keep silent. Esther, much like Bathsheba, I believe, with little or no choice. The king asked her to spend the night in verses 15 and 16. And this was a night of immorality. They weren't married. And she did just that. In verse 17, we're told that Xerxes was attracted to Esther more than any other So this Gentile king set a royal crown upon Esther's head, making her the first queen in Persia had known in the last 4 years. In chapter 3, Mordecai, Esther's cousin, her quasi-stepdad, he would frequent the king's gates. You see, he loved to chat politics at the king's gate with the king's noblemen. When Mordecai in verse 2 refused to bow down or show respect to the king's top political official, Haman, a descendant of the Amalekites, who were longtime enemies of the Jews that used to kill the Jews, Haman in verse 5 and 6 was incensed. He was absolutely incensed when Mordecai would not bow down to him. He was filled with wrath at Mordecai's disrespect. Haman's wounded pride drove him not to seek Mordecai's life alone, but also the lives of his people, to annihilate every Jew on the face of the then known planet. There were holocausts before the Holocaust. In verse 8, Haman convinces King Xerxes with half-truths how the Jews disrespected the Persian Empire and the king's laws himself, even though they were not. In verse 9 and following, messengers were sent with sealed instructions across the entire land. In verse 13, the text says, to destroy and to kill, to annihilate every Jew, young, old, women, and children. And by the way, the edict also said, I want you to take everything that the Jews own, take it all. I want you to plunder them. And in chapter 4, Esther enters the story again. She learns that Mordecai is crying loudly and bitterly on the city streets. But she doesn't know the reason for his weeping. You see, living in isolation in the palace, she was unaware, absolutely unaware of the decree to execute all of the Jews in these 126 other regions. Persia, in verse 4 to 7, Esther sends her attendant to find Mordecai, and he returned with a copy of the edict to annihilate the Jews. He also gave her a message directly from Mordecai. We read it. To Mordecai. In verse 8, the message goes like this. Go into the king's presence to beg him for mercy and plead with him for our people. In verse 11, Esther sends word back to Mordecai. Any woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned or asked, the king has but one law, again as we read, that he or she be put to death. There's only one exception, Mordecai. Should the king extend his gold scepter upon entrance to his court, my life would be spared. Mordecai responds to Esther yet one more time with what has become some of the most well-known texts in the scriptures, verses 13 and 14 in chapter 4. Esther, do not think that because you are in the king's house, that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from some other place. You see, God's will never be stopped. Even if Esther did not go into the king's presence, God's will would continue. You and I can never frustrate the ultimate plans of Jesus. We are not strong enough or smart enough. His plans will always flourish. And who knows, Esther, but that perhaps you have come to this royal position for such a time as this. Esther responds in verses 15 and 16. Mordecai, gather all of the Jews and fast for me for 3 days, and I'll fast as well. And when this is done, I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Summarizing chapter 5 to 8, Esther found courage. She risks her life to approach the king. He extends his scepter to her and grants her request to hold 2 banquets for the king and for Haman. Haman, the man plotting to kill the Jews. In the banquet, Haman is exposed, and the king has him executed. King Xerxes goes a step further. He issues a second decree, erasing the first decree, granting Jews in every city, the text says, the right to assemble, the right to protect themselves, and the right to fight against any force that would ever come against them. Jews today hold on to this text. Courage. A couple of thoughts about courage as we continue to ponder the life of Esther this morning. Courage is the God-given power and ability to do something brave, to be steady, resolute, unshakable, unmovable, bold, and unafraid. Esther had the courage to face the biggest mountain in her life, her husband, the king of the most powerful nation in the then known world. She had the God-given courage to reveal her hidden ethnicity, that she was Jewish. She had the courage to perhaps lose her status as queen. And she had the courage to do the right, the most difficult thing, even though it meant losing her life, perhaps. Chapter 4, verse 16. I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. If I perish, I perish. You see, accepting the possibility of the worst case scenario in her life, in our lives, her own death. Esther was now free to live. What could they do to her if she accepted her own mortality? She was now free to live courageously. First Baptist Church, like Esther, endowed with courage, the God-given power and ability to do something brave, to be strong and resolute, unshakable, unmovable, bold and unafraid. Like Esther, endowed with courage, knowing that nothing ever happens in your life without God's will somehow, some way being factored into it, means that you and I are able to face whatever mountain that comes our way. A relational mountain, an emotional mountain, a mental mountain, whatever that mountain, a physical mountain, whatever it might be. Knowing that nothing happens in your life or my life without somehow God's will being factored into that, gives us courage to live courageously. Courage. Courageous living often affects more people than ourselves. Courageous living often affects the many, not just the one. You see, Esther's courage just didn't save or affect her life. No, her courage caused the king to act differently than he did in the past, to extend grace and compassion to Esther rather than to execute her. Esther's courage affected evil Haman as well. Justice came upon him. He lost his life. He was brought to justice for plotting to kill the Jews. Esther's courage affected a nation, 79,000 Jewish people. First Baptist Church. living courageously doesn't just impact your life. It affects many people. Did you know there's many, many people watching you? There's many people watching your life. Your courage affects the many. It affects your children as they watch you live courageously. It affects your spouse. It affects your friends. It affects your work colleagues. It affects other Christians. It affects those that you attend church with. It affects First Baptist Church. Your courage motivates, inspires, it encourages others towards the God of courage. Courageous living always affects the many. It saved the lives of almost 80,000 Jews. Last but not least, courage trusts in the providence of God. Courage trusts in God's providence. If you look a little closer into the book of Esther, you'll notice that God is never mentioned in the book. Not once. In exile, these Jews have no king of their own. They have no army and no prophet, no words from God, no land, no temple, no worship, no priesthood, no sacrifices. God is nowhere to be found in the book of Esther, on the pages of the text. God appears to be silent. There's no recorded miracles in the book of Esther. But God is working. Providence means that God is working behind the scenes, quietly, invisibly, overseeing every action, governing every circumstance through the normal course of everyday life. God, in the most pagan corner of the world, Iran at that particular time, worked through and used the everyday lives and decisions of Mordecai and Esther to bring about his will. Without knowledge, without sight, in the dark, in their imperfect decisions, in everyday life, God was working out his purpose for their lives and the lives of a nation. God's providence means that God has been and is working behind the scenes, quietly and visibly, overseeing every action, governing every circumstance through the normal course of everyday life, right here at First Baptist Church. I want you to keep that definition of providence in your mind, and I want you to please hear my heart. Hear my heart as I share this. God has been showing the board at First Baptist Church through the course and circumstances of everyday life that we have, by necessity, step back, generally speaking, from functioning in the ministry of the church to becoming more of an advice-giving or an advisory board. Personal challenges that individuals we face as a board, as we do as a congregation, have made it difficult for us to be a ministry board, and we become more of an advisory board. Lord has been showing us as a congregation in the course of everyday life, the life of the saints at First Baptist Church, that much of the ministry demands our church has. Much of the ministry demands of our church are greater and bigger than our capacity to unleash them. By necessity, as many of you know, many or most of those demands have come my way. In the course of everyday life, everyday circumstances of daily living, Joanne, Jo, my wife, her 17-year-old battle with an autoimmune condition has become significantly more challenging for her, and as a result, it's become significantly more challenging for me. I love God's providence in the giving. I don't like God's providence in the taking away. I accept and I surrender to the providence of God. You see, He's been working behind the scenes, quietly, invisibly, overseeing every action, governing all the circumstances, in and through even our imperfect decisions. And so I want you to know that I accept that I am no longer able to sustain my role as a solo pastor at First Baptist Church. I have submitted my letter of resignation after 5 years. Incredible honor to be here, effective the end of March. I just want you to know that no one has done anything wrong. It's no one's fault. It's not the board's fault. It's not my wife's fault. You need to know that Joanne has never once, ever asked me to go home and care for her. Ever. No, like Esther. I see the providence of God at work, even though I don't like it. Please know that my decision to step back from ministry, I'm retiring from ministry. It's not self-seeking or self-serving. Joanne and I have no plan B. I'm not leaving to pastor another church somewhere. I'm not using First Baptist as a launching pad for other ministry opportunities. Indeed, I will need to work something gainful at least half-time. In faith, I'll be looking for non-ministry related work. Perhaps emotions now and in the future will run rampant. And even though that's happening, or it may happen, I want you to know that there's 3 things I would like you to consider. Number 1, don't cut and run. I preached a sermon a little while ago. You know, it's easy to worship on the other side of the challenge. It's tough to worship in the middle of the challenge. Don't cut and run. Number 2, we need one another, especially now. We need to discern next steps. And the board and the congregation will need to work together to do it. I realize there's a myriad of emotions, and I don't want to rescue you from those emotions. But I also want you to know that there's more than grief. I've had the privilege of being here for 5 years. Perhaps I have some tunnel vision, but God has done some amazing things in our church. Amazing things. Chris and Diane came to our church. Worship was pretty much extinct in our church. Through the worship of Chris and Diane, tremendous healing came through their music. The last 5 years, God has freed many of us from our past. He's taught many of us to forgive and to love. He's brought unity to our body where there wasn't a lot at one time. And He's taught us how to trust again. So I just want you to know, I don't want anyone to feel like they have to walk on eggshells around me. I'm still Greg. More than happy to talk and do life with you. As I said, I would stay till April the 1st or something like that. I can't remember the date. And maybe, and be honest, maybe you don't want that. Some churches don't want that. I'm open. I want what's best for the church. So please don't go away today blaming yourself. It's not your fault. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you for this time together. Thank you for your word, Father. I pray you would help each and every one in this place and space to be courageous. That we would see things as you do, Lord. And that we'd be free to grieve openly, honestly, and freely. I pray that our grief would take us to you, to the feet of Jesus. Lord, you hold this church together. And I pray you would continue to